The Imperial Guard consists of billions of humans across millions of worlds and represents untold different fighting styles. In this video we'll be looking at the main regiments available to us and how we can get the most out of them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the battlefield. Today we're continuing with our look through the Imperial Guard codex, with a broad look at each individual regiment, so we'll be looking at their regiment trait, warlord trait, relic, stratagem and unique order. So without further ado, let's start with the Cadians. So Cadians' regimental doctrine is born soldiers. This means if they stand still, they get to reroll hit rolls of 1 with all of their ranged weapons. This is a simple and effective buff to get more out of your firepower, though it does incentivize you to make more static play, as otherwise you won't be getting any benefits from this regiment. On top of that, if an infantry squad is ordered to take aim, then instead of just getting those reroll 1s, it will instead get to reroll all hits, which is incredibly good. So this trait is going to be particularly good for any unit in your army that wants to be staying still all game. Particularly artillery and mortars can make good use of this, as they'll almost never be moving under normal circumstances, having long range and ignoring line of sight, meaning that you can sit there quite happily plinking away at the foe. It can also be good for our battle tanks, the Leman Russes, as a lot of their guns have decent enough range not needing to move, and if this is the case then they'll be slightly more damaging than they would have been otherwise. Infantry squads, particularly those with special and heavy weapons, will get more out of this as well. Those reroll 1s can be great with plasma weapons, and the orders really put that absolutely through the roof. By ordering a squad with take aim, then that plus the additional born soldiers benefit means that you actually get a 50% damage increase on your ballistic skill 4 weapons, so infantry squads can make really quite efficient use out of their heavy weapons such as las cannons or missile launchers. Naturally, as this doesn't affect units on the move, Cadians are less incentivized to take things like Hellhounds, Valkyries or advancing infantry, and it means if you are playing a fully competitive guard list, it might be better to take your static elements as Cadian and your advancing elements as a different regiment, like I did with my recent competitive list. Cadia has some other benefits as well, including their warlord trait, superior tactical training. Every time your warlord issues an order, on a 4+, he can immediately issue another order to another infantry unit within 6 inches. So this can let you get a bit more efficiency out of your company commanders. It's obviously particularly good on Creed, as he has 3 orders base, so it could be good to stick in the middle of a big infantry gunline firebase and take advantage of all of those nice full rerolls to hit. I'm not sure if it beats out Old Grudges or Grand Strategists for me, but the same could be said of most of the traits in the codex. Their relic is the Relic of Lost Cadia, which is absolutely bananas strong when it's applied against Chaos, and it's decently strong otherwise as well. You use this once per game and unveil it at the start of your turn. Any Cadian models within 12 inches can reroll 1s to hit and wound, which is really quite a strong buff just by itself. It'll amount to something like 36% damage increase. Obviously a lot of your Cadians might well be getting reroll 1s from standing still, so this can be a good relic to allow them to move forward and still get their rerolls. Rerolls to wound are generally quite rare in the game, so it's quite nice to have a source of them, and that could be particularly handy in an artillery firebase or something. However, it's against Chaos that this relic is absolutely crazily powerful, as instead of rerolling 1s to hit and wound, it's rerolling all hit and wounds. So it's essentially giving your army a mini Guilliman for a turn, and this combined with the Vengeance for Cadia stratagem, which you can put on another unit outside the relic's range, can make the whole game a real uphill struggle for a Chaos opponent. It puts the damage output of all weapons through the roof, particularly anything that's hitting or wounding on 4s, which is quite common in the guard decks. A really good relic, and I'd certainly consider it if I was playing Cadian. Next we have Overlapping Fields of Fire for 2 command points, which is another very significant buff to shooting. You activate this after you've chipped a wound off a key target, and for 2 command points, all of your other army units get +1 to hit that unit for the rest of the shooting phase. So ideally you want to be chipping off a wound with something not very significant. Things like sniper rifles can be good for this, and then unleashing your heavy guns when they have the +1 to hit in effect. It can be one of the tools that can help you deal with -1 to hit modifiers, which guards usually struggle against. Really good synergy buff for a shooting army, and not to be underestimated. Their unique order is Pound Them to Dust, a tank order that will allow you to reroll the number of shots when you fire a turret weapon from a Leman Russ, such as a battle cannon. This is good because you can combine it with their reroll 1s to hit when they're stationary, so you can have the best of both worlds, like Catachan tank commanders can. Certainly a decent option for your tank commanders. Cadia also have a bunch of special characters, including Knight Commander Pask, who is a great way to get another tank commander in a list, Lord Castellan Creed, who can farm out a ton of orders, and Colour Sergeant Kell, who will be great at working with Creed and is a cheap little elites choice. Overall, Cadia is definitely one of the strongest regiments out there. Moving on, we come to Catachan, and their regimental doctrine Brutal Strength, +1 strength to any infantry models, and +1 leadership if they're nearby an officer. And Catachan vehicles can reroll the number of shots when they're firing a weapon that has a random number of shots, such as a flamer, a battle cannon, or a plasma cannon. The infantry buff, I would say, gives them around about the strongest infantry out of the whole guard decks. These guys can be absolutely lethal when combined with priests or their Colonel Strachan to give them 3 strength 4 attacks in the fight phase, as well as their usual shooting lasgun goodness. +1 leadership also makes this infantry death wave less susceptible to morale shenanigans, which is very nice. And obviously their tank doctrine will synergize with any of the weapons that have random shots, in particular Catachan units like their Wyverns, battle cannons, executioner plasma cannons, and regular plasma cannons wherever you can put them. And of course Hellhounds are another great pick with Catachan. So strong infantry, really strong battle line tanks, what's not to like? Their warlord trait is lead from the front. Their warlord has a 6-inch heroic intervention, and they can reroll failed hit rolls until the end of the turn whenever they charged, were charged, or did a heroic intervention. Could potentially be good on Iron Hand Strachan, who actually has a half decent melee profile, but most guard characters aren't going to be fighty enough to really make good use of this, and you're usually best keeping them out of close combat in the first place. Their relic is the Mamorph Tusk Blade, a power sword with +2 strength, AP -3 and damage 2. It's very similar to the Blade of Conquest, so a little bit underwhelming in that stage, but its flat 2 damage does make it not so bad at killing Primaris Marines if you are trying to build a fighty guard warlord. You could potentially use it to soup up a company commander going forwards, but personally I'd probably just buy them a Power Fist and save my relic for something else. Their unique order is Burn Them Out, which means the ordered unit can reroll the number of dice when determining the number of shots a flamer or heavy flamer can do when it's determining its number of attacks. This is most useful on things where you can pack a lot of these into one unit, such as veteran squads with flamers and heavy flamers, or maybe command squads with full flamers. Even on a full flamer squad, however, it's only very, very slightly better than giving them the order to give them reroll 1s to wound. So honestly, I'm afraid it is a bit underwhelming, and for me the flamer isn't in the best place in the guard codex at the moment in terms of special weapons. Their stratagem, called Vicious Traps, can be a cheeky surprise once in a while. You use it when one of your units inside a terrain feature has just been charged. On a 4+, that unit takes D3 mortal wounds, so it could be used to take out an incoming fightier character that only has 1 or 2 wounds left, but in general it's not the best efficiency in terms of command points for mortal wounds. They have the characters Colonel Ironhand Strachan, who's a real deal for 75 points. He has the normal orders of a company commander, his great +1 attack aura, and a decently fighty and survivable character profile for a guard commander. I'd strongly consider him if I was running a Catachan detachment. We also have Sly Marbo for some infiltrating and assassinating shenanigans, and Sergeant Harker, who is another really great choice. He has a souped up heavy bolter, gives everyone around him reroll 1s to hit, so could be amazing to plonk in the middle of a big infantry battle line, or to give your artillery both reroll 1s to hit and reroll number of shots, meaning they'll generally be hitting harder than Cadians. Next up we have the Armageddon Steel Legion. Their doctrine, Industrial Efficiency, gives infantry units an 18-inch rapid fire with rapid fire weapons like lasguns and plasma guns, and their vehicles ignore AP -1, so if they're shot with a heavy bolter it will count as AP 0 against that vehicle. The rapid fire bonus isn't too bad at all when you're using an infantry gun line with rapid fire weapons, and is particularly nice on the plasma guns. I find the tank durability is a bit random. Most of the time you're not particularly worried about AP -1 weapons for the most part, so it doesn't come into effect all that often, and might not even come into effect at all against some armies that don't have AP -1. So not my favourite for vehicles, to be honest. But the infantry one is interesting, and it will add up to more shots over the course of a game if you are sending in waves of lasguns towards your opponent. It could also help them out a bit with their Chimera strategy, disembarking units from Chimeras to rapid fire away. Their warlord trait is a bit rubbish unfortunately, as again it's another close combat buff for a warlord. You add 1 to the warlord's attacks characteristic, and add 1 to wound rolls made for your warlord in the fight phase. Again, this is one of the traits that can make a guard commander just limp into being just about okay in the fight phase, but comes at the opportunity cost of getting a better warlord trait that can buff other units, and means that you have to put your warlord on the front line to get any benefit out of it. Their relic is the Skull Mask of Acheron, which is -1 leadership to enemies within 3 inches and -2 for orcs. This is rarely going to have any decent effect. At the very best, you might cause one more model to flee from a squad, but that's going to be dependent on a whole load of situational things, like your guard commander surviving being that close to the enemy, and while you damage but don't destroy an enemy unit. I'm afraid it's a really bad relic. I wouldn't ever take this one. Their unique order is Mount Up, which can allow one of your Armageddon Steel Legion squads to shoot and then get back into a transport vehicle if they're within 3 inches of the vehicle. I could see this being useful in a mech vets sort of list, although it does mean that you'll have to get out of the Chimera for one turn, shoot the enemy, survive being shot again, and then use this order in the next turn to get back into the vehicle, as you can't use it after you've disembarked from the same vehicle that turn. So potentially useful, a nice little option, but not one that I will be routinely using all the time. Finally, their stratagem, Armoured Fist, is a 1 command point stratagem to allow a squad that disembarks from a Chimera to reroll 1s for the shooting phase. It'll have its best value with a big unit of veterans, I think, getting out of a transport and then overcharging plasma guns to keep them safe from killing themselves with their own weapons, or you could potentially combine this with an order, such as reroll 1s to wound, or first rank, second rank fire for the las guns. Unfortunately, guard infantry squads getting out of vehicles aren't ever going to be all that big, so the value of this is only ever going to apply to quite a small unit, unfortunately. Overall, I'd say that the Armageddon Steel Legion aren't one of the strongest choices, unfortunately, though they do have some interesting options around mechanised armies. Next up, we'll look at the Tallarn Desert Raiders. Their doctrines Swift as the Wind allow infantry to advance and still shoot, and their vehicles to shoot heavy weapons with no penalty even if they moved. These are both great buffs to allow your infantry and tanks to keep on the move while dealing decent firepower. On the infantry, it's really not too bad at all. You'll be moving an extra d6 inches with those infantry squads each turn, helping them close with the enemy, get to objectives, or get out of harm's way, all while maintaining a decent rate of fire. I feel that it's even stronger on the vehicles though, as it really helps with a lot of options that the guard have. Vehicles that want to be moving and shooting, but the penalty for moving and shooting heavy weapons gets in the way. It's great on sentinels, Leman Russ battle tanks with sponsons, tank commanders, devil dogs, hellhounds for their weapons that aren't auto-hitting, and it can let you do some silly things with artillery as well, say by moving your basilisk its full 12 inches per turn and then still firing to full effect. It's a really strong regimental doctrine to have on an armoured force, as it'll keep you mobile. Their warlord trait, Swift Attacker, allows your Tallarn units to charge after falling back if they're within 6 inches of the warlord. This can make your Tallarn infantry into a decent skirmish screen, allowing them to fall back, maybe shoot with get back in the fight, and then charge into melee again. The main issue with this is that guard aren't particularly good in melee, and it might well just be worth staying out and forcing your opponent to wade through Overwatch to get to you. It might be good if you're fighting other similarly weak infantry, but I wouldn't personally build this in as my warlord trait, as guard and melee just don't go together very well, unless you're running something like Bullgrins. Their relic is the Claw of the Desert Tigers, I believe Captain Alarim's old knife. It's a power sword that's strength user, AP -3, damage 2, and they can make 2 additional attacks. Again, a moderate boost to a guard commander that I'd be tempted to take a power fist instead of, and save the limited relic slots for something more tasty. The Tallarn order is a tank order, called Get Around Behind Them, allowing them to move an extra 6 inches in the shooting phase, either before or after they shoot. This is probably best used for making your Leman Russ battle tanks essentially jump, shoot, jump, so they can move out in the movement phase, shoot your opponent in the shooting phase, and then use the extra 6 inches to get out of line of sight behind cover, potentially saving them from any reprisals. That, combined with the fact that you can move and shoot heavy weapons for no penalty, makes your Tallarn tank commanders incredibly mobile and very frustrating to play against. Tallarn is definitely another one of the top choices for fielding tank commanders. Finally, we have Ambush, their stratagem for 3 command points. You can use it during the deployments phase, and you may set up 3 Tallarn units, only one of which can be a vehicle in ambush. You then can move them on in outflank, and you can deploy them anywhere 7 inches from the table's edge and more than 9 inches away from enemy units. I'd say that this is particularly good for leading a flank attack with some infantry squads to try and steal some backfield objectives, but you can also use this to keep important units off the board until turn 2. Say if you have a shadow sword and you absolutely want that to get the first strike on your opponent's army before it gets shot itself, then this is a way to facilitate that. And you can also use it to get things like Leman Russ Punishers in range or Hellhounds right in the face of the enemy. It's a very nice option indeed, but it does come with a hefty cost at 3 command points. Next we have the Mordian Iron Guard. Their Parade Drill doctrine will affect their infantry, and they gain +1 leadership if all of its models are touching bases together in the unit, so if they're in a sort of like block formation, as I'm sure they'd be on the parade ground. All your units also get to hit on 5s in Overwatch as well, meaning that charging a Mordian gun line can be quite a tough prospect. Now this isn't a bad bonus, but again it's situational, it doesn't apply against every army. There's going to be plenty of armies in the game, such as Tau for example, that just aren't even going to charge you at all with anything, so you've pretty much wasted your entire regimental doctrine in that matchup. Having said that, sometimes this can be quite powerful, particularly if you have a Leman Russ and you can use defensive gunners on it, meaning that you'll be hitting on 4s in Overwatch, which could be enough to deter a charge or kill whatever is charging you. It's not really one of my favourite regimental doctrines, but it is strong in the right matchup. The leadership buff is helpful, but it does interfere with your optimal positioning of your infantry squads, so it might not always be the best to bunch up. Their warlord trait is Iron Discipline. You roll a dice for every model that flees in a friendly Mordian squad within 6 inches of the warlord, and on a 4+ that model does not flee. It's not too bad, but you are already a little bit more resilient to morale than most armies with the doctrine, and in my experience it's often better to let those cheap guard infantry go, and just use your warlord trait to do something else that more helps the army, particularly things like old grudges or farming command points. Their relic is the Iron Star of Mordian, gives the bearer a 4+ feel no pain type save, effectively doubling the unit's survivability against incoming fire. This is genuinely a reasonably good defensive relic, could potentially be helpful if you're worried about snipers, but generally I prefer to try and keep my warlord safe by keeping him behind the front lines, maybe cowering in a ruin somewhere. And by that I mean cleverly directing his troops from the backfield. That sounds a bit better. Their order is Form Firing Squad, and that's genuinely an interesting order. It can make your Mordian infantry squad be able to target characters with their rapid fire weapons, even if they're not the closest unit to the squad. This could be particularly good for plinking the last few wounds off a buffing character with your infantry squads, and it could potentially be very powerful when combined with a plasma veteran unit to jump out of a transport and rinse the enemy commander in a bunch of plasma fire. I probably wouldn't actually build around making this order work, but it's a good one to remember for when the infantry squads are tangling with the enemy. Occasionally I suspect a time will present itself when this is definitely the best choice to make. Their stratagem is volley fire for 1 command point, which was recently nerfed in the September FAQ unfortunately. Until then, it was one of the best stratagems in the entire Guard Codex, letting you fire the entire weapon again every time you rolled a 6 to hit with any one of your weapons. Now it's essentially 1 command point for every time you roll a 6 to hit. You can make 1 additional shot with the same weapon, which is mathematically the same as reroll 1s in terms of how much extra damage you're likely to get from it. It's not awful and it is quite flexible. It can give you a little bit of extra damage output where you need it, and of course it's going to be best on an infantry squad that's as big and killy as you can make it, likely either a huge unit of conscripts with 1st rank, 2nd rank fire, or maybe a squad of veterans armed with some fancy war gear like plasma guns. Overall, I'd not say Mordian is one of the strongest regiments, but the Overwatch is a fairly solid counter against some melee lists. Moving on, we have Valhalla, the Russians in space. Their regimental doctrine, Grim Demeanor, means that they halve the number of models that flee from morale, and their tanks count as having double the number of wounds left in terms of the vehicle damage table. The first one is genuinely a decent survivability boost to your infantry battle line, as Guard infantry battle lines do tend to lose casualties from morale. The vehicle upgrade can situationally be quite good, but it's very easy for your opponent to play around it and just focus on killing your vehicles outright rather than just leaving them damaged. Occasionally it will help your damage output, but like with some of the other doctrines, there are entire games where you may get no benefit whatsoever from it, so it's just not reliable to be honest. Their warlord trait is Tenacious, which gives their warlord a 5-up feel no pain, or a 6-up if it's a vehicle. Could be a way to make a tank commander a little bit more survivable, but comes at the downside of letting your opponent shoot that tank commander because it's not a character that's less than 9 wounds. Their relic, however, is actually a really strong one. Petrov's Mark 45 is a relic bolt pistol that has AP-1 and damage 2 and fires 2 shots, and it basically gives you the old style commissar rolls, where when an infantry squad fails a morale test, one model gets blammed by the commissar's bolt pistol, and then that morale test is considered to have been passed. This is good because it makes conscripts a lot more viable, as it's one of the best ways to get fearless conscripts back on the board. I'm sure we'll talk about this further in the conscript video that I'll be doing. The Valhallan order is Fire on My Command, which will allow one of your infantry squads to fire into close combat at some enemy models, and if you roll a 1 to hit, then it hits your friendly models instead. This could be fairly decent, but bear in mind that you can only use it with your infantry units. You can't use it to rain battle tank shells into the ongoing melee, which would be great. One niche use of this could be to try and take out one of your units that has got surrounded with your own fire, and therefore let the enemy unit get shot by your heavier guns, because it's no longer wrapping them up in close combat. Their stratagem, sent in the next wave, is unfortunately fairly useless. It costs 2 command points, and it's basically when you have lost a unit of Valhallan infantry, you can set them up back in your deployment zone as if they hadn't been killed. But Games Workshop have decided that this should also cost you reinforcement points, so you can't use it at all unless you've left points spare from your army to use it. I'd rather just have the units right from the start of the game, rather than paying both command points and reinforcement points, and only getting to use the unit once one of your units has been killed. So overall, Valhallan can be quite durable for an infantry list that just wants to hold as much ground as possible and not die, and they can make conscripts more viable than they'll be virtually anywhere else. Last, for the standard regiments, we have Vostroya. Their regimental doctrine is heirloom weapons, with an extra 6-inch range, to all weapons that are 24-inch or greater in range and are either heavy or rapid-fire weapons. This is great for your standard infantry squads. You'll get more lasguns in range. Any weapon that fulfills the criteria will get a decent boost out of it and have more target selection. In particular, this is great on the Leman Russ Demolisher and Leman Russ Punisher, who have insanely powerful shooting, but their main disadvantage is that they have a short 24-inch range, and keeping the enemy within 30 inches is a lot more doable than trying to get within 24. A simple and pretty effective doctrine there. Their warlord trait is Honoured Duelist, which is rerolled failed hit and wound rolls when you're in combat with your warlord, which is honestly probably better than the other melee warlord traits, and could have a Vostroyan commander punching far above his weight, but as always it comes at the downside of putting your warlord in close combat, which is generally a bad idea from the get-go. Their relic is the Armour of Graf Tushenko. Gives the bearer toughness 4 and a 2-up save, so it can really help the durability of one of your key characters should you need it. I guess you could situationally think about buying this in if you're worried about snipers and you have a character that you absolutely need to survive. Their unique order is Repel the Enemy, which means that they can make a shooting attack while in close combat against an enemy that's within 1 inch of them, which could be situationally useful, but I think it's more likely that you're going to be wanting to fall back and just use get back in the fight to shoot them with lasguns there instead, rather than remaining in close combat where guard generally don't want to be too much. Still, it's another good option to have in the toolbox. Finally, their stratagem is one of the best reasons to run Vostroyan. It's simple and effective. For 1 command point, your unit gets +1 to hit in the shooting phase. This is a really nice stratagem. You can use it on whichever unit is going to get the most out of it each turn, but obviously you're going to get more out of it the bigger the unit you use it on. So it's great on tank commanders, Leman Russ Demolishers, and potentially things like Baneblades or Shadow Swords. A really good stratagem. I'd strongly consider using this one every turn if I was Vostroyan. Finally, we come on to the Militarum Tempestus, and you get the doctrine for this if you have a pure Militarum Tempestus detachment. It's a Stormtrooper's doctrine, which means that when they're shooting an enemy unit that's within half range of their weapons, every roll of 6+ will allow them to make an additional shot with this weapon. Mathematically, again, this is usually the same as reroll 1s, but it can be defeated by -1 to hit modifiers. Annoyingly, this won't apply to the hotshot lasgun when you come in from deep strike, as you'd have to be closer than 9 inches to the enemy, which you can't be if you set up from deep strike. It's very good on overcharged plasma guns though, coming in from deep strike, to pile a bit more hurt on the foe. Their warlord trait is Faithful Servant of the Throne, which can be used to deny a psychic power as if they were themselves a psyker, so it could be handy in some matchups, but I wouldn't usually make this your default warlord trait, as it'll be entirely useless against armies that don't have psykers. Their relic is the Tactical Auto Reliquary of Tiberius, which is a bit of a mouthful, which will let them issue 1 additional order on a roll of 2+. They can do this for each order that they issue, so you could have your Tempesta Prime spit out up to 4 orders per turn. Their unique order is also a really good one. It's called Elimination Protocol Sanctioned, and will allow you to reroll failed wound rolls against a monster or vehicle target for the ordered unit. Again, this is absolutely great on something like Plasma or Melter Scions, who will be able to put out some very reliable firepower on a vehicle or monster that they're dropping in to mess up. Finally, their stratagem is Superior Intelligence, which is essentially an interceptor type stratagem, a bit like Auspex Scan from the Space Marine Codex, but it only costs 1 command point. You have to use this on an infantry unit, so no Taurox Prime Gatling Cannon intercept unfortunately, but it could be a nasty little surprise on a Plasma Scion command squad, if the opponent isn't expecting this to go off. This is very situational, but when the situation happens, it could be very powerful indeed. Overall, the Militarum Tempestus bonuses are a nice little addition to Tempestus Sounds, but they don't necessarily need to be run in their own detachment. They're still reasonably strong without these benefits. So which are the best regiments for competitive play? In my opinion, the Cadian, Catachan, Tallarn and Vostroyan stand out above the rest. They all have some really strong assets that they can bring to the table, particularly Cadian and Catachan, which are just great all-rounders. As always, let me know if there are any things that I've missed with your favoured regiment, and if there's anything else important that I've missed with this review. We'll be continuing with our regular guard episodes over the next weeks and months, so please subscribe if you'd like to see more from Auspex Tactics. Feel free to support my Patreon if you are enjoying all the content that I'm making at the moment, as I'd like to get to a point where I can focus more on this channel as a legitimate part of my work compared with my real world job. Thanks very much for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.